Breaking news, I have communicated with Albert Breer in the last 24 hours. And he communicated back to me. It was via text, if you really want to know.
I do.
Give my source away. It was me reaching out to him saying, how'd you like to come on the show? And he said, thank you.
Did you say?
No, I said thank you after he said, okay.
And then you wrote LY?
No. What's the matter with you? Although I do love Albert Breer. What's up, Albert? How are you, sir?
Hey, I don't know if I didn't sign off on you revealing the contents of our conversation there.
It was, how'd you like to come on? I gave you time. You're like, how about earlier? I said, all right, here's earlier. And you said, okay, that's it. I gave the ghost away. So
I'll tell you what, like Clay Matthews is out there in Southern California, right? You gotta tell him to stay loose, maybe. Too,
whatever,
right?
whoever he wants. I said, if Joe Rogan's the new quality control coach, I'd take that to make this happen by now. What is as we were sitting here, 20 minutes after noon, new league year begins in what would you say, 24? I can't believe I'm doing math
I think
right
it's
now.
like 20. Is it the math 28 hours?
28 hours.
I don't know. You know where I went to school. I'm not great.
I'm more verbal. Go for it. What's going on? What's happening? What's the latest?
Yeah, I think this is sort of up to Aaron. You know what I mean? Like, and I think that's sort of where this is. And I think everybody's expectation is that this is going to happen. And this to me, like, the Alan Lazard thing, the Randall Cobb thing, in all seriousness, is the Jets getting their ducks in a row. And I think as much as anything else, it's a realization that, like, this is what the lag in the final decision, the final parts of the negotiation, that this is what it's doing to that. Like where if he had been on board on Saturday, say, the Jets could hit the ground running and work on this stuff Monday and Tuesday, and everything's done. Now, it just sort of feels like they've got to line everything up and get everything in place. And maybe this is intentional on Rodgers' part, that he'd want to see them actually do this and put all the pieces in place. But my understanding is for a little while now, this has sort of been up to Aaron. And I think the trade terms are workable. I don't know if they're going to have to give up the 13th overall pick to do it. And I think the contract terms are workable too. If you look at it, really, Rich, it's about cash. Like that's what this is about, because the way the Packers structured the contract was really smart. Made them tradable. Like where the cap number for a team acquiring him for next year is just $15 million. Now you're gonna have to pay the piper down the line. The question is whether or not you're willing to pay $60 million in cash to get him. I think in large part this is really up to Aaron and what he wants to do, and it certainly feels like the Jets are doing everything they possibly can to get him on board. And
the new league, the new league year is the deadline, or there really isn't one? Do you think?
I don't know if there is a deadline, although it certainly seems like you see the actions here of the Jets, like that it's being treated like a soft deadline. So look, I think Aaron himself said at one point, right, like that. And I can't remember if that was this year or last year, to be honest with you, but he at one point referenced the start of free agency as wanting to have a decision by then.
Right.
So whatever team he's on can plan going forward. So it feels like that's a natural point. And I think we've been over this too, Rich. Like, the Packers are operating in a much different manner than they have in the last couple of years. Where the last couple of years it's been take your time, Aaron. Whatever you need, Aaron. We're leaving the door open for you, Aaron. We want you to be at peace with whatever your decision is. In this case, it certainly feels like the Packers have already started the process of moving on and would like a decision sooner than later.
Well, and then, there's no other. The options are retire, go to the Jets. Is returning the Packers really an option at this point in time?
I guess
after
you could
all
say
this,
no, but then I'm old enough, and you are too, to remember Brett Favre sauntering into training camp in 2008 like he was going to be the starting quarterback.
Yeah, but they did tell him that was still over. They told him it was still over at that point in time.
Yeah. So that one got really awkward at the end. So, who knows, but, and again, like, I think he's just sort of, he's unpredictable. You know what I mean? And I think we've seen that, that the guy, maybe for better or worse, marches to the beat of his own drummer. But I do think that, the momentum here is towards him becoming a New York Jet, and if not that, then either he retires or things get awfully awkward.
Sports Illustrated's Albert Breer here on the Rich Eisen Show. Why not Aaron Rodgers in Vegas? Why Jimmy G and then assuming they're going to draft a 7th overall pick quarterback, or Jimmy G's arrival means no? I mean, walk me through the Raiders' decision-making process.
So I know I've used this analogy with you a lot, Rich, and I'm going to wear it out again, but like it's the Alex Smith and Kansas City analogy, right? Like where the Chiefs brought in Alex Smith in 2013, not thinking he's going to be the quarterback for the next 10 years, but it gave them somebody that they thought they could win with, right? And somebody who would allow them to keep their options open at the position, and somebody that would allow them to build a contender, you know? And they were able to do that. Because of that, like they didn't have to force it in 2014 or 2015 or 2016. And then eventually they found a guy they really loved, and Patrick Mahomes went all in on him. And by the time Patrick Mahomes got there was a fully formed team waiting for him, which, you know, created a great situation for Mahomes to develop in. That was the idea the Raiders had with Derek Carr last year, and doing the extension with him didn't work out. And I think that's sort of the idea this time around with Jimmy Garoppolo, is that you're creating your flexibility for yourself at quarterback, and that, Jimmy's going to be your quarterback probably for the next few years, but he doesn't preclude you from going into the top 10 and getting one if you think there's a really special one there. And in the meantime, you don't have to overextend to get one that you might like but not love. And so that allows you to use the capital that you have to build up the team around the quarterback. And so I think it's as much as anything about bringing in a guy who's a known commodity, you know, and they projected some with Derek Carr, and that didn't work out. A guy who, you know, knows what the culture is, knows what the setup's going to be, and is going to be able to hit the ground running. And, you know, a guy who, again, allows you over the next few years to sort of survey the draft classes that are coming into the league and wait for someone that you think is really special that you can go up and get aggressive to go get.
So Jimmy G finally gets an exit visa from San Francisco after all this time, and it's to Vegas. And then on that day, the Niners agree to terms with Sam Darnold, who obviously wasn't going to get a gig in Carolina, starting gig there, with them moving all the way up to the 1st overall selection in the draft. What do you make of the Darnold acquisition by San Francisco?
You know, I actually had them kind of like pegged for maybe Baker Mayfield. You know, so like this is the same idea, I think. It's bringing in a guy who's got talent, he's got physical ability, who, you know, maybe it becomes something, maybe it doesn't. At the very least, it's going to push Trey Lance and give them another option while Brock Purdy gets healthy. And if you look at the timeline with Brock Purdy, it's going to be tight. You know, like him being able to start the opener, this is typically like a 6-month recovery. Maybe he gets back faster, maybe not. But either way, you know, you're working on a really, really tight timeline with a guy that you presumed was going to be at least taking the first rep in OTAs and the first rep at training camp, right? Whether or not he held on to the job, if Trey Lance turns a corner, you know, we'd see on that. But, you know, it's sort of, I think, saying, okay, like we're going to see what happens with Trey Lance, but we're going to make sure that we cover our butts on the back end. We get another guy who's got some talent in here to compete. And this is going to basically get us through until Brock Purdy is back. And whether Darnold emerges or Lance emerges over the next 6 months, you know, we've given ourselves a better chance to have a viable option before Brock Purdy gets back. And again, maybe one of those guys really breaks through and you have somebody that really makes you think, should we start him or Purdy? You know, but at any rate, like at a relatively cheap rate, you're giving yourself the chance to have multiple shots at getting the quarterback position right, and you're doing it at a price point that allows you to go out and get a Javon Hargrave on the free agent market too.
That's it. I mean, what a day for the 49ers there, and Albert Breer here on the Rich Eisen Show. I had a top 5 list, you know, going into after the Super Bowl about the top 5 storylines of the offseason, and my bonus one that I had was I can't wait to see how the Sean Payton Broncos start to form.
Yeah.
And the 49ers lost Mike McGlinchey, one of their offensive linemen. They're a terrific offensive lineman at Denver. Ben Powers also winds up in Denver yesterday. We're hearing about receivers potentially being on the market. They're out of the first and second rounds because of the Russell Wilson deal. What is your read or reporting on what Sean Payton and the Broncos are up to right now?
Here's what's really fascinating about what Denver's doing. I think it mirrors what Sean Payton built in New Orleans for the most part, for the most of the time there. Right now, at the end, they did pay Michael Thomas, they did pay Alvin Kamara, but if you look before that, right, for his first, I would say, 13 years or so in New Orleans, what you'll find is a heavy, deep investment in offensive linemen, whether it was guys like Jari Evans, early on, or Teron Armstead, and Zach Strief, throughout, you look at the names of the guys that they were investing in over the years, and almost always, Rich, it was offensive linemen, right, on that side of the ball. Even when they paid a guy like Jimmy Graham, right, they paid Jimmy Graham, who was a great player for them. He only lasted in New Orleans on that contract for 1 year, and they traded him away. So, to me, this is an acknowledgement that they're going to be building the same way that they did in New Orleans. And if you look at New Orleans, what you'll find is the foundation of those teams is on the offensive line. And Sean Payton bet on himself and bet on his scheme that he was going to be able to identify young skill players and make it work with maybe a little less money sunk into the skill spots. And I think that kind of counters, counters perception too, right? You would think a Sean Payton team would be investing deeply in skill positions. But the truth of the matter is, if you look at the way they spent draft capital, the way they spent their money over the years in New Orleans, there was much greater investment in the offensive line. And I think that's what we saw in Denver in day one of free agency under Sean Payton.
Albert Breer from Sports Illustrated here on the Rich Eisen Show. A few more minutes left with him on the Tuesday before the new league year begins and free agency writ large begins in the National Football League. Let's get to Lamar, because at 4 Eastern time on Wednesday, that's when anybody can reach out to Lamar if they have 2 first-round selections to offer the Ravens, should the Ravens not match whatever contract they come up with Lamar Jackson. We have put together a list of teams that are quarterback needy, supposedly. It's now down to 7, and we have the Atlanta Falcons up there. I think we could remove them from this equation now, because they signed Taylor Heineke this morning, and the way that they signed Jesse Bates as safety yesterday, it's obvious that they're going to build around Desmond Ridder right now and go that way and give big money to other defensive players. The Washington Commanders might be off that board. Sherry Burris, who's new to NFL Network, reporting that she spoke to Ron Rivera on Monday, and Ron said absolutely they're not in the Lamar Jackson game. The Jets are about to be going Aaron Rodgers. What is Lamar's market as he hits this franchise tag free agency? Albert.
You have a really hard time you just said it, Rich. You have a really hard time going down that list and finding a team that you say, absolutely, they're going to put in, they're going to push their chips to the middle of the table and see what happens. I don't know. I think I think Atlanta's probably the best example, right? Because I think what you're implicitly seeing from teams here is we want to wait for someone, and this is, I think, a few of the teams, and the Raiders are sort of in this boat. Like I said, the Falcons. I think the Panthers were there, then they moved up. It's we're going to wait to find somebody that we really, really love, and until then, we're not going to spend huge money on a quarterback. I do think what Daniel Jones and Derek Carr got scared teams a little bit, and so I think if you look at it, right, it's how many boxes do you have to check to be all in on Lamar Jackson? You have to be comfortable with his injury history. You have to be comfortable with a big contract. You have to be comfortable with flipping your offense upside down and running a different type of offense with him. You have to be comfortable with a lot of different things to get there. And then, you look at the big contracts last year, right? I think there were 5 real big contracts for quarterbacks last year. So you had Deshaun Watson in Cleveland. You had Russell Wilson in Denver. I'm probably going to miss one here. You had Derek Carr in Vegas.
Kyler in Arizona.
Kyler Murray in Arizona, and Aaron Rodgers in Green Bay. That's 5, right?
Mm-hmm.
Who's happy after a year?
I guess, who's happy in terms of what? The player or the organization?
Who's happy with their return right now?
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a real thing, the price has escalated to a point with quarterbacks where I think that there are some teams now that are pulling back and are saying, you know what, until we're really sure, until we find somebody that checks every single box for us, we're going to stay loose, you know? And we think that going – and Tampa, for example. Tampa's another one of these teams. We'll go get Baker Mayfield to compete with Kyle Trask, and you know what? We'll try to tread water and build up the roster everywhere else and spend our money everywhere else. We don't need to go spend $35 million a year on Derek Carr. You know what I mean? Like, so I think that that's the environment that's working against Lamar Jackson right now, is that teams, I think, are a little less willing to take swings on quarterbacks, expensive swings on quarterbacks, you know, because the price point has gotten to that point. And so I think to some degree it's all the boxes you have to check to be all in on Lamar in the first place. But I think there's also, you know, like this economic environment around the quarterbacks that's working against Lamar too. But I would say this, it can't hurt to place that phone call. You know what I mean? Like, if you're a team that isn't completely sold on his quarterback, why not at least make the phone call?
I know it just, but it doesn't.
The
question is who's going to make that phone call, and some of the other boxes that need to get checked that you didn't mention confuse, I think, a lot of fans because of how terrifically talented Lamar Jackson is.
Yep.
And the two of them, I spoke to Scott Pioli about this on NFL Network yesterday, is, well, we don't want to do the work for the Ravens by hammering out a deal that they couldn't negotiate for Lamar and do all the paperwork only to be left, you know, empty-handed. And I said, well, what are you worried about? The billable hours for your legal staff? That makes no sense. Like, it's worth going for.
I guess the concern would be pissing off your quarterback, like if you have one.
Well, unless you're in Indianapolis, you don't have one. If you're in Indianapolis, you do not have one. There's no quarterback to piss off. You know,
you don't. But are you planning to draft one? You get the 4th overall pick. Are you planning to draft one? And then you look at it and say, well, we're going to come out of this with a quarterback at like $8 or $9 million a year. Do we really need to go spend $50 million on one? You know, I think that's sort of part of the equation there. Like, I'll give you a good example. Let's have some fun with this, okay? And I don't want anybody sticking report : on front of this or whatever, right? But
okay.
like, let's say, look, New England wasn't completely happy with Mac Jones last year, right? Bill Belichick liked Lamar Jackson coming out. Now the question for them was whether or not we turn our operation upside down and build a new offense for him. You could say Bill would be building the Navy offense for him, right? Like,
yes.
If you really want to have fun with that.
Sure.
So like the issue that you have is, like, if you go and sign Lamar to an offer sheet and the Ravens match, where does that leave you with Mac Jones? Do you understand what I'm saying? So, like, I think I think some teams that have quarterbacks that might even be intrigued by it could look at it and say, if we do that, is that going to create a bigger problem for us in the back end of the Ravens match?
I get it. And it's also might be a process that drags on into late March, and you got to make your moves, certainly with free agency, and build your team. And if you're going to be building your team around a guy who is expensive as Lamar Jackson, when you have somebody on your first contract, a rookie contract, clearly that changes the entire dynamic of how you build your team. So I get that. The other box that people don't understand that needs to be checked is the fact that Lamar doesn't have an agent. And I just want to kind of dig into that real quick. Because when we hear he doesn't have an agent, you have to deal with his mom. It makes it sound like it's that Wedding Crasher scene where Lamar's in the basement screaming for meatloaf. You know what I mean? So how does it actually work? Like, is there nobody with a legal background or anybody who has sort of an agenting skill that's unofficially his agent? Like, is he really? You got to call his number or his mother's number to make a deal?
I mean,
is that it?
I can remember that. Like, it's interesting because that circle is very, very small, right? So I'm assuming like he would hire a lawyer to look over the thing. But I can remember this. I'll give you like an anecdote. Like, so I remember in 2018 when he was coming out, I remember hearing like A.B. Elam. You remember him for the Jets, right? Like, he advises a lot of players that have come out of South Florida, and I remember hearing, oh, well, A.B. Elam's gonna work with him. And so I was like, okay, like, so I went to the combine, and actually, I wound up getting to Lamar by himself, and I was like, I wanted to ask him, like, hey, is A.B. Elam advising you? And he said no. He's like, I think he knew Abe, but he was like, no. And I think that's sort of, I mean, it's sort of like, to me, like, like looking back at that now 5 years later, it sort of crystallized like how tight the circle around him is. And, like that's just the way I think it's just, Lamar's so loyal to the people that he grew up around and everything else. Like, I think that's part of it. Now, I'd assume like you cannot sign a contract without hiring a lawyer to look at it, right? Like, so I think that's part of this. The NFLPA is also helping him, and that's part of it too. They have some people who are sort of the administrators that oversee the agents and everything else, and he has some help on that end also. But yeah, it's without question like a very untraditional thing, and I think that's part of it too. Is like if you're another team, you're going directly to Lamar with this, which creates a really, really interesting dynamic.
All right. In the 2 minutes I have left here, Albert, your thoughts on who did the Panthers trade up to go get? Because, with you saying, well, the Colts are going to draft a quarterback 4th overall, they might not be happy with the 4th on that scale because somebody could trade up with Arizona to beat Indianapolis to the punch. So how do you see that playing out?
Well, I think Arizona's in the catbird seat now. I can tell you this: like the Bears were convinced that the Texans are taking a quarterback 2nd overall. They actually had some talks with the Texans about the Texans moving up to 1. The Texans, I don't think, were quite ready to jump, and the Panthers coming up didn't call the Texans because they didn't want to. They were so convinced that the Texans are taking a quarterback at 2 that they didn't want to alert the Texans to how serious they were about moving up, So if you're locking it in now and you're saying the quarterback's going 1, the quarterback's going 2, now the Cardinals are in a huge position of strength where they can say anybody else who wants one's got to come up and talk to us. And you can make the Colts feel really uncomfortable too, where it's like you're going to have 2 off the board by the time the draft gets to you. And if you don't deal with us, it could be 3. So, I think the Cardinals are in a position of strength now and being able to move that pick, and maybe they only have to move down 1 spot. And yeah, I think for the Colts, this creates an interesting scenario where, look, history tells us, right, Rich? There may be 4 that go in the top 10. They're not going to be all 4 of them aren't going to make it, right? It's just what the numbers tell us, what the history tells us. Maybe 2 make it, right? So let's say you're the Colts and, you say, okay, these 2 are going to make it and those 2 are gone when you're picking. What do you do? To me, that's the scenario where Christian Ponder goes 12th overall, because the Vikings that year really liked Jake Locker, which wouldn't have worked out either. But they wound up sort of turning a guy who was probably a 2nd-round pick for them into the 12th overall pick. And now that guy winds up getting Leslie Frazier. That pick winds up getting Leslie Frazier fired. That's a sort of tricky situation I think the Colts are in right now, which is tough for them because, so much of this year, I think, in the way that the last half of the year was handled was based on being in position to settle the quarterback spot once and for all 4 years after Andrew Luck stunned all of us with his retirement.
So you think, again, I got about 30 seconds, Stroud, Young, Richardson? What do you think?
So my understanding is the Panthers are very, very comfortable with 2 of them and think 2 of them are worth going 1st overall. They are going to do everything with all 4 of them, and they're going to see if a 3rd or a 4th kind of jumps into that group with the 2, in which case maybe they would consider moving back down a spot or 2.
Wow.
So that's sort of where they're at. My suspicion would be that it's Young and Stroud. I don't know that. But it's going to be interesting to see what happens. Ownership's going to be involved in this, and I would expect that we're going to see, the traveling band. We've seen that in the past, right? Where, Scott Fitter, the GM, and Dan Morgan, the assistant GM, and Frank Reich, and maybe the owner too, David Tepper may go along too, are in Gainesville and Columbus and Tuscaloosa and Lexington over the next, 5 or 6 weeks, taking a really, really close look at each of these kids. To see, how they're going to set up their strategy for April.
You're the man, Albert. I always appreciate the time. You make me smarter. Love our chats. Take care of yourself, brother. Thanks.
All right. Thanks, Rich. I appreciate it.
Follow Albert Breer on Twitter. I do. He must follow. Catch the Rich Eisen Show every single day on the Roku channel, 12 to 3 Eastern, for free.